It's March 18th, 1945, and Oberleutnant Klaus Richter crouches in the rubble of what was once a farmhouse outside Remagen, Germany. Through his binoculars, he watches 5 American Sherman tanks advance across the muddy field, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. The morning fog clings to the ground, and he can smell the acrid smoke from burning vehicles mixed with wet earth. Richter signals his panzer crew. They have the element of surprise. The Americans don't know they're here. His Tiger tank, hidden behind a collapsed barn, has already knocked out 3 Shermans this week. The plan is simple. Wait until they're within 800 meters. Fire, relocate. But then something strange happens. The lead Sherman suddenly stops. No warning, no apparent reason. Then, as if choreographed, all 5 tanks pivot in perfect unison. Not toward Richter's position, but toward a wooded area 200 meters to his left, where his supporting infantry lies concealed. Within seconds, the Shermans open fire on the infantry position with machine guns and high explosive rounds. Richter watches in disbelief as his carefully laid ambush disintegrates. The American tanks never even looked in his direction. How did they know? What Richter didn't understand, what almost no German commander understood throughout the entire war, was that he wasn't fighting 5 individual tanks. He was fighting a single coordinated organism, connected by technology that was years ahead of anything the Wehrmacht possessed. To understand the magnitude of this advantage, we need to go back to 1940. When the German panzer divisions swept through France, they did so with what seemed like unstoppable coordination. Guderian's armoured thrusts, the rapid encirclements, the blitzkrieg, all of it appeared to be the result of superior German tactical radio communication. But here's what most people don't realise. In 1940, only German company and battalion commanders typically had radios in their tanks. The average Panzer III or Panzer IV crewman communicated with his platoon through hand signals and coloured flags mounted on their turrets. Yes, flags. In 1940, the Germans did have more radios than the French or British at the time, which gave them a critical edge. But by 1942, when American Shermans began rolling off production lines at the Fisher Body Plant in Detroit, every single Sherman, from company commander down to the lowest tank in a platoon, came equipped with at least 1 radio, and usually 2. Let me say that again. Every Sherman had a radio, not just the commander's tank, every single one. Captain William Bill Lovelady of the 3rd Armoured Division described it in his memoir. We could talk to each other, to the infantry, to the artillery, to air support, even to headquarters 10 miles behind us. Meanwhile, Jerry, that's what they called the Germans, was still waving flags and hoping his platoon could see him through the smoke. The SCR 528 was the vehicle-mounted radio set installed in most Shermans. It operated on the FM band, which was revolutionary for battlefield communications. Unlike the AM radios that were standard in European militaries, FM transmission was virtually immune to interference from engine noise, static, and atmospheric conditions. The system had a range of about 20 miles for tank-to-tank communication, and could reach up to 30 miles when communicating with more powerful base stations. But range wasn't even its most important feature. To understand why American tanks had such superior communications, we need to understand a fundamental difference in military philosophy between the United States and Germany. German armor doctrine in the 1930s and early 1940s was built around the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Commanders would give subordinates an objective and allow them considerable freedom in how to achieve it. This worked brilliantly when German tanks had qualitative and tactical superiority, but it assumed that individual tank commanders were highly trained, experienced, and capable of independent decision-making. The American approach was different. American military planners, particularly at the Armored Force School at Fort Knox, Kentucky, understood something crucial. America was going to fight this war with citizen soldiers, not a professional military caste. These would be mechanics, farmers, teachers, and shop clerks who enlisted or were drafted, given months of training and shipped overseas. The American system needed to make average soldiers perform exceptionally well through superior coordination and support, not individual heroics. Enter a man named Colonel Alvin C. Gillem Jr., who in 1941 was serving on the planning staff for the newly created Armored Force. Gillem had studied the German campaigns in Poland and France extensively, and he'd reached a controversial conclusion. The German success wasn't primarily about better tanks or better tactics. It was about better information flow. In a memo dated August 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, Gillem wrote, "The tank of the future will be less a lone warrior and more a node in a communications network. Victory will belong to the force that can process and disseminate tactical information faster than the enemy." This was a radical statement. Remember, in 1941, most military theorists still thought of tank combat in terms of individual tank versus tank duels, like aerial dogfights but on the ground. Gillem pushed for every American tank to be equipped with radio communication as standard equipment, not optional add-ons. He argued that the cost of radios would be offset by the increased effectiveness of coordinated action. He won the argument, barely, and by late 1942, American tank production had fully integrated the SCR 508 series radios into the Sherman design. The SCR 528 radio system was manufactured by the Galvin Manufacturing Corporation. You might know them better as Motorola, and represented the cutting edge of mobile communications technology. Let's talk specifications for a moment, because they matter. The system consisted of 2 main components: the transmitter-receiver unit and the control box. The transmitter operated on 10 preset frequencies in the 20 to 27.9 MHz range, which was designated for tactical military use. This allowed entire armoured divisions to operate on coordinated frequency plans, with different battalions, companies, and platoons on different channels that could be quickly switched. The control box was mounted near the tank commander's position and was designed to be operated even while wearing thick winter gloves, a small detail that made a massive difference in combat effectiveness. But here's what really set it apart. The SCR 528 used frequency modulation FM instead of amplitude modulation AM. Without getting too deep into radio theory, AM signals vary the strength of the radio wave to encode information, while FM signals vary the frequency. FM transmission has several massive advantages for military use. It's less susceptible to interference, it has better sound quality, it requires less power for the same effective range, and, critically, it's much harder to jam or intercept at long range. German radio intercept units, which were quite sophisticated, found American FM tank transmissions extremely difficult to monitor. The signals would often degrade into unintelligible noise before German listening posts could effectively triangulate their source or decode their content. Technical Sergeant Robert Bobby Early, who served as a radio operator in the 4th Armoured Division, recalled, "We could hear the Germans on their AM sets sometimes, especially at night when radio conditions were good. But they couldn't hear us worth a damn. Our FM signal just didn't carry the same way to their intercept equipment." The Germans, meanwhile, continued to rely primarily on the Funk Garrett 5 series radios, which were AM-based, had shorter effective range, and required significantly more maintenance. German tank radios were also notoriously unreliable in cold weather, whereas the American sets, built to commercial standards and mass-produced with quality control, operated in conditions from North African heat to European winter. Now we get to the heart of the matter. How did this technical advantage translate into battlefield success? The Sherman tank has a complicated reputation. It was under-armoured compared to German Tigers and Panthers. Its 75mm gun couldn't penetrate the frontal armour of heavy German tanks at normal combat ranges. German tankers called them Tommy Cookers, or Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up the first time every time. These criticisms weren't entirely unfair. A Panther or Tiger in a direct frontal engagement with a single Sherman had a tremendous advantage. But here's what the statistics actually show: the overall kill ratio for American armour versus German armour in Western Europe from 1944 to 1945 was roughly 1.2 to 1 in favour of the Germans. That sounds bad until you realise that given the Sherman's technical disadvantages, analysts had predicted it might be as high as 5 to 1 or even 10 to 1 in Germany's favour. So, what made up the difference? Radios. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked in practice. It's July 29th, 1944. The 3rd Armoured Division is pushing through the bocage country of Normandy, those dense hedgerows that turned every field into a potential kill zone. Lieutenant James Bates commands a platoon of 5 Shermans, moving along a sunken road toward the village of Tessy-sur-Vire. Bates's lead tank, commanded by Sergeant Mike Moretti, rounds a corner and immediately spots a Panther tank hull down at the end of the road, about 600 meters away. The Panther crew sees them at the same moment. In a traditional engagement, Moretti's Sherman would be dead. The Panther's 75mm KWK 42 gun could punch through a Sherman's frontal armour at this range like paper. Moretti's 75mm gun, on the other hand, couldn't reliably penetrate the Panther's frontal armour. But Moretti doesn't engage. Instead, he immediately radios, "Contact Panther, 12 o'clock, 600 meters, hull down." Then he does something that seems counterintuitive. He reverses, using the terrain to break line of sight before the Panther can fire. While Moretti is backing up, Lieutenant Bates, who has heard the radio call, is already issuing orders over the platoon net. 2nd and 3rd tanks advance right through the hedgerow. 4th and 5th with me to the left. Moretti, keep him interested. This all happens in under 15 seconds. The Panther commander is now facing a tactical nightmare. He knows there's a Sherman somewhere in front of him, but it's disappeared behind terrain. He doesn't know there are 4 more Shermans now flanking his position through the hedgerows on both sides because his platoon mates can't tell him. They're 200 meters behind him, with no radio contact, unable to see what he sees. 30 seconds later, Bates's Sherman emerges from the hedgerow at the Panther's 4 o'clock position. The side armour of a Panther was much thinner than the front. The Sherman's gun could penetrate it. 2 shots and the Panther is burning. The engagement is over in less than a minute. This wasn't unusual. This was standard American armoured doctrine, enabled entirely by the fact that every tank in Bates's platoon could communicate instantly with every other tank. German tankers' accounts from the Western Front reveal a consistent, growing frustration with American tactical coordination. Hauptmann, Captain Hans von Luck, who commanded a panzer battalion in Normandy, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The American tanks seem to operate with a singular intelligence. We would engage one and suddenly 3 more would appear from unexpected directions, as if they had been summoned. Our tactical doctrine emphasized individual tank commander initiative, but against an enemy that fought as a coordinated whole, individual excellence was not enough." Oberfeldwebel, Master Sergeant, Otto Carius, a Tiger tank ace with over 150 tank kills to his credit, observed, "Against the Russians, our superior optics and guns gave us the advantage. Against the Americans in France, I often felt we were fighting blind. They knew where we were before we knew where they were." Carius attributed this to American air superiority, which was certainly a factor. But after-action reports from German units consistently describe scenarios where American tanks would respond to contact with coordinated movements that seemed impossibly fast, faster than visual signals or motorcycle couriers could account for. The truth is, many German commanders never fully understood what they were up against. They knew the Americans had more tanks, more fuel, more supplies. They knew about American air power, but the radio advantage was invisible, and its effects were attributed to other factors. A captured German operations officer, interrogated in February 1945, was asked why American armoured attacks seemed so well coordinated. His response: "They must have excellent training and rehearsals. Perhaps they practiced these maneuvers for weeks before executing them." The interrogator, an American lieutenant, wrote in his notes, "Prisoner seems unaware that American tank platoons can communicate in real time via radio. When informed of this, he appeared skeptical and said he would not believe all tanks in a platoon had radios unless he saw them himself." But the radio advantage went beyond tank-to-tank coordination. The SCR-508 series radios could communicate directly with American artillery units, forward air controllers, and infantry commanders. This is where the American system became truly devastating. On December 22nd, 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Captain James Leach's tank company from the 4th Armoured Division was advancing toward the besieged town of Bastogne. They encountered a German blocking force, infantry with anti-tank guns supported by several Stu G-3 assault guns. In German doctrine, this was a solid defensive position. The Sturmgeschütz were well camouflaged, hull down, with good fields of fire. The infantry had Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. An American assault would be costly, but Leach didn't assault. He radioed a fire mission directly to the supporting artillery battalion, 6 miles behind him. Fire mission: enemy armour and infantry. Coordinates: Echo 73245. Over. The artillery battalion's fire direction centre plotted the mission in under 2 minutes. 4 batteries of 105mm howitzers, 24 guns total, fired a coordinated time-on-target mission. All 96 shells arrived at the German position within a 3-second window. Before the smoke cleared, Leach's tanks were already advancing. The German position was obliterated. Leach's company suffered 0 casualties. This level of coordination, tanks calling in artillery fire missions directly, without routing requests through multiple headquarters, was routine for American armoured units by late 1944. It was almost unheard of in German forces, where fire support coordination often required multiple radio relays through battalion, regimental, and division headquarters. Delays that could stretch to 15 or 20 minutes. Master Sergeant Early, the radio operator I mentioned earlier, put it bluntly. We didn't fight fair. We fought smart. If we saw something we couldn't kill ourselves, we'd get somebody who could kill it. Artillery, air support, tank destroyers, whatever. Usually took less than 5 minutes from contact to ordnance on target. Here's another aspect of the radio advantage that's often overlooked. American radios were designed for mass production and field maintenance. The SCR-528 was built using modular components. If a radio failed, a unit armourer could swap out the bad module and have the set operational again in under an hour. German radios, by contrast, often required specialist technicians and custom parts. By 1944, the United States was producing approximately 1,500 Sherman tanks per month. Every single one rolled off the production line with its radio already installed, tested, and tuned. The Motorola plant in Chicago was producing thousands of SCR-528 sets monthly, with quality control that would make modern manufacturers envious. German tank production, hampered by Allied bombing, resource shortages, and Hitler's interference in design priorities, never exceeded about 600 tanks per month at its peak, and not all of those tanks received full radio equipment. There are documented cases of German Panther tanks being delivered to combat units without radios, with notes saying the radio equipment would follow later. In some cases, it never did. The American advantage wasn't just technological, it was systemic. The United States had created an integrated production pipeline that treated radio communication as essential equipment, not optional luxury. Colonel Ernest Harmon, who commanded the 2nd Armoured Division, wrote in a 1945 report, "The difference between American and German armour is not primarily in the quality of individual vehicles. It is in the system. Our tanks are components in a coordinated whole. Theirs are individual warriors, however impressive." The American radio superiority also created unexpected intelligence advantages. Because American FM transmissions were difficult for German signals intelligence to intercept, American units could communicate relatively freely, without fear of compromise. German units, using AM radios, had to maintain much stricter radio discipline, because they knew the Allies could, and did, intercept their communications regularly. The Allied Y Service, signals intelligence units, routinely intercepted and decoded German radio traffic. This provided operational intelligence that helped Allied commanders anticipate German movements. But there's an even more subtle advantage here. Because Germans knew their communications were vulnerable, they often avoided using radios when they could, relying instead on motorcycle couriers or landline telephones. This made German response time slower and reduced their tactical flexibility. American commanders, confident their FM transmissions were relatively secure, used radio freely. This created a positive feedback loop. Better communications led to better coordination, which led to tactical success, which reinforced the doctrine of radio-dependent coordination. There's a fascinating incident from March 1945 during the Rhine crossings. German intelligence officers, frustrated by their inability to intercept American tank communications, began reporting to headquarters that American army units must be maintaining radio silence as part of operational security. In reality, American tankers were chattering away on their FM nets, coordinating movements, calling in fire support, and sharing tactical updates. The Germans simply couldn't hear them. Let me give you 3 specific examples where radio communication directly saved American lives and changed tactical outcomes. Example 1. The ambush that failed. February 8th, 1945, near Prum, Germany. Sergeant Bill Chapman's Sherman is leading a column through a narrow forest road. His radio operator, Private Eddie Nakamura, suddenly picks up a German voice on an open frequency. Their AM radio is transmitting in the clear, probably because they think they're on a secure channel. Nakamura speaks German. He translates, "Wait for the third tank. When the third tank passes your position, open fire." Chapman immediately radios the warning. The column stops. Rather than advancing into the ambush, American infantry dismounts and flanks the German position. 12 German soldiers with Panzerfausts are captured without a shot fired. Chapman's after-action report notes, "Without the radio, we'd have driven right into them. First 3 tanks would have been knocked out, probably casualties in every crew. Instead, 0 friendly losses." Example 2. The friendly fire that didn't happen. March 26, 1945. The Rhine River crossing. Multiple American and British units are operating in close proximity. A British armour column accidentally advances into an American sector. Lieutenant Bob Fraser, commanding a Sherman platoon, sees tanks approaching through morning fog. The silhouettes could be German Panthers. They're about the same size and shape as British Cromwell tanks from a distance. Fraser radios, "Unidentified armour, 300 metres north." Can anyone confirm? Within 30 seconds, he gets a response from battalion headquarters. "That's King Tango Lima, British 7th Armoured. Friendly. Do not engage." Fraser holds fire. Potential disaster averted. Compare this to an incident 3 weeks earlier in the same sector, where a German anti-tank gun crew, with no radio communication, fired on friendly German tanks they misidentified in poor visibility, destroying one and killing its crew. Example 3. The Rescue, January 4th, 1945. Battle of the Bulge, Private First Class. Leo Blanchard's Sherman is hit by a German 88mm anti-tank gun. The tank is immobilized, on fire, 2 crew members wounded. Before abandoning the tank, Blanchard grabs the radio handsets and transmits, "This is Charlie 3-2. We're hit. Bailing out. Wounded aboard." Blanchard and his surviving crew members take cover in a nearby crater. German infantry are advancing on their position. 6 minutes later, 6 minutes, 2 other Shermans from Blanchard's platoon arrive at the wreck, providing covering fire. A half-track medical vehicle, dispatched immediately when the radio call came in, evacuates the wounded. All 5 crew members survive. Blanchard later said, "Without that radio call, nobody would have known we were down until maybe an hour later when we didn't show up at the rally point." By then we'd have been dead or prisoners. That radio saved our lives, plain and simple. It would be wrong to suggest the Germans didn't understand the value of radio communication. They did. German armor doctrine had emphasized radio coordination since the 1930s. But by 1944, Germany was losing the production war, the resource war, and the technological war simultaneously. In late 1944, German High Command issued orders for increased radio equipment in tank units. Priority was given to producing the Funkgerät 5 and its successor models, but production numbers tell the story. Germany produced approximately 45,000 tank radios of all types during the entire war. The United States produced over 300,000 SCR 508 series radios just for armoured vehicles. And that's not counting infantry radios, artillery radios, or air-ground communications systems. Furthermore, many German tanks delivered in 1944 to 45 were pressed into service incomplete. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, admitted in post-war interrogations that by early 1945, approximately 30% of German tanks were being delivered without full communications equipment due to shortages of radio components and the complex vacuum tubes required for their operation. There's a painful irony here. Germany had pioneered many radio technologies in the 1930s. Telefunken and Lorenz were world-class electronics firms. But under wartime conditions, with factories bombed, supply chains broken, and resources diverted to increasingly desperate wonder weapons programs, Germany couldn't maintain its technological edge. Meanwhile, American industrial capacity was running at full throttle, completely untouched by enemy action. Otto Carius, the Tiger Ace I mentioned earlier, wrote bitterly about this. We had the better tanks, the better guns, the better optics, but they had radios in every tank, artillery that answered in minutes, and air support that appeared like clockwork. In the end, their system defeated our excellence. But here's the crucial point. The radio advantage wasn't just about technology. It was about doctrine, training, and an entire philosophy of warfare. American armored doctrine emphasized team coordination over individual prowess. Training at Fort Knox drilled tank crews on radio procedures, communication discipline, and coordinated maneuvers. Tank commanders were taught to think in terms of platoon-level tactics, not just their own vehicle. German doctrine, rooted in the traditions of the Prussian officer corps, emphasized individual initiative, tactical genius, and the leadership of exceptional commanders. This worked brilliantly when Germany had the resources, training time, and quality of personnel to support it. But by 1944, Germany was drafting teenagers and old men, giving them minimal training, and throwing them into combat in vehicles that were often mechanically unreliable and inadequately supplied. Under these conditions, the American system, which made average soldiers perform exceptionally well through superior coordination, had an overwhelming advantage. Captain William Lovelady, who I quoted earlier, observed, "A good German tank commander with a Panther could beat any one of my Shermans in a straight-up fight. But we never fought fair. We fought 5-on-1, with artillery support, air cover, and infantry. And we could coordinate all of that in real time, because every vehicle could talk to every other vehicle. That's not a fair fight. That's modern warfare." This radio superiority wasn't limited to the European theatre. In the Pacific, where terrain and jungle often made visual coordination impossible, Sherman tank platoons used their radios to maintain contact and coordinate movements that would have been impossible otherwise. In Italy's mountainous terrain, American armor commanders could call in artillery support from batteries they couldn't even see, positioned on the other side of ridgelines, coordinated entirely by radio and pre-planned fire missions. The British, after fighting alongside American armor units in North Africa and Italy, adopted similar radio systems for their own tanks. By 1944, British Shermans, operating under Lend-Lease, and new British designs like the Comet incorporated radio sets based on American FM technology. Even the Soviets, though they developed their own radio systems and doctrine, were impressed by American communication technology. Soviet tank commanders who received Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease consistently praised their radio equipment as superior to domestic Soviet sets. Lieutenant Dmitry Loza, a Soviet tank commander who received American tanks, wrote, "The American radios were a revelation. Clear, reliable, long range. Our domestic radios were adequate, but the American equipment was simply better engineered." Here's the supreme irony of this entire story. Germany entered World War II as a technological pioneer. The Blitzkrieg itself was enabled by radio coordination. German scientists and engineers led the world in optics, chemistry, rocketry, and jet propulsion. But the United States won the technological war, not through individual breakthroughs, but through systematic application of good enough technology at massive scale, integrated into doctrine, and supported by industrial production that Germany simply could not match. The SCR-528 radio wasn't a wonder weapon. It wasn't revolutionary science. It was well-engineered, mass-produced, reliable equipment that worked every time in every tank, maintained by adequately trained crews who understood its value. In many ways, the radio advantage symbolizes the entire American approach to World War II. Not individual genius, but systematic excellence. Not wonder weapons, but logistics. Not tactical brilliance, but coordinated teamwork. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, after fighting American forces in North Africa and later defending Normandy, wrote, "The Americans do not solve military problems by appealing to military genius. They solve them by bringing material resources to bear on a scale that makes genius irrelevant." Rommel meant it as criticism, but from an American perspective it was high praise. Why depend on genius, which is rare, when you can create a system that makes ordinary soldiers extraordinary? So let's return to Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, crouched in that rubble outside Remagen, watching his ambush collapse as American tanks coordinate their response with what seemed like telepathy. Richter survived the war. His response: they fought like they were one organism. I would engage one tank, and suddenly I was being engaged from 3 directions by tanks I hadn't even seen. It was like fighting a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more appear. We never understood how they did it. We thought it must be training, or perhaps they had observers we couldn't see. The story of the Sherman tank's radio advantage is really a story about how wars are won. Not always by the best individual weapons, or the most brilliant tactics, or even the bravest soldiers, though all of those matter. Sometimes wars are won by invisible advantages, systems, logistics, coordination, and the ability to make thousands of ordinary people work together as effectively as dozens of geniuses. German troops never knew American Sherman tanks had the world's most advanced radios because the advantage was invisible. You couldn't see it. By the time German commanders understood what they were up against, it was far too late to counter it. The war of production, of systems, of coordination had already been won. One radio at a time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into World War II military technology and tactics, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let me know in the comments. What other overlooked technological advantages would you like to see covered? And until next time, remember, sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one your enemy doesn't even know you have.